Let's make 4th of July a blast with these adorable rocket sugar cookies. Hi, I'm Leslie with Leslie's Cookies and Treats, and if you love decorating sugar cookies or you want to learn how, you're in the right place. Let's decorate together. So today let's make these adorable rocket bear sugar cookies, and all of the supplies I use will be listed in the description. I hand cut these cookies, and if you're not familiar with how to do that, I'll leave a link in the description for a video tutorial. And all of my royal icings are about a 15-second consistency. And I started by outlining and flooding in the front bit of the rocket, and I'm just going to use my scribe here to settle that icing down and further shape it into the triangle. And then I'll give this blue icing some time to set up and dry. And I'm going to move back to the fire at the end of the rocket and just go ahead and pipe that in here using my red royal icing. And then once I get it all settled down with my scribe, I'm going to immediately grab some yellow icing and make some flames, and then use my scribe to kind of blend that all together and make it kind of look like fire. So this is called a wet on wet effect, and I just put my yellow icing right into the red icing, and I'm going to keep doing that until I have my fire looking the way I want it to. I'll continue to try to just blend it in with my scribe. You could also use a toothpick. And then I set this cookie aside to dry until the icing had crusted over, and now I'm coming back in with my red icing, and I'm just going to touch down, lift up my piping bag a little bit, and go around the outline of the rocket. I'm going to put a squiggle of icing in the middle to help prevent craters. And then I'll flood this area in by piping right over that squiggle I made and putting a generous amount of icing in this area. You want to make sure your icing is at least a 15-second consistency so it doesn't overflow the edges. And then, as I always do, I'll use my scribe to settle this icing down, make sure that it gets all the way down to the cookie. And then I want to put some little star sprinkles in this area. So I have these little itty bitty stars, and I'll leave a link in the description for the products I used. Then moving up to the bear, I want to paint in the inside part of his ear. And so I just put a couple dabs of royal icing down, and I'm using a dampened paintbrush where I've wiped off all of the water just to make it smooth. And then I actually set this aside to dry until the rocket had crusted over, and now I'm just going to come in and make a half circle for his body right on top of that rocket and then flood that in. I'll use my scribe to settle it down and then set this cookie back aside to dry once again. While you wait for each one of these sections to dry, go ahead and work on some other cookies and then come back and add in his head just by making another circle on top of the body. And flood that in and use your scribe to settle the icing down just like we did before. I'm also using my scribe to shape my icing here into more of a circle. And then I set this cookie aside to dry for quite a bit, and now I'm coming back in and putting a little squiggle of brown icing, and I'm taking a dampened paintbrush and I'm just dabbing up and down on my brown icing to give it a fur-like texture. My paintbrush was almost dry when I started, and I need to be really careful here because my icing isn't completely dry underneath, and so I did dent my bear, but it's okay because we'll fix that later. Moving on, let's go ahead and pipe in the rest of the ears just by making a line around the outside edge of both ears, and if you need to, use your scribe to settle down any start and stop points. And then moving down, let's give this bear a leg, so just make a nice oval over the top of this rocket and flood that area in, and use your scribe to pop any air bubbles and shape his leg as needed. And then pipe in his arm the same way. And after this has had a chance to dry, we'll go back in and add that fur-like texture again. You could have waited all the way until the end to add that texture, but I decided to do it as I was going along. So now that my face has had a chance to dry, I'm going to go back in and do a wet on wet effect for this hat. So I'm going to flood in a rectangle with the red icing on the outside edge, and then immediately grab my white icing and make another rectangle right next to the red, using my scribe to settle each section down and pop any air bubbles as I go along. And once I'm done with the white, I will grab the red again and do the same thing all the way across the hat. Because I'm piping wet icing right next to wet icing, all of these will dry as one solid surface of red and white icing, with no area of separation between the colors. And while I wait for the hat to dry, I'm going to come back in and put a big circle for his snout right over the area that I dented my icing. And then I'll use my scribe to settle that icing down and make it smooth. And then we can come back in and carefully give texture to the ears and the arm and the leg using the same process we used before. And again, you don't have to do that at each section. You could wait until your bear is completely dried before doing this, and then you don't have to worry about denting any of the areas as you use your paintbrush in an up and down motion to put the texture on. In fact, you don't even need to add texture to your bear, but for real, this texture is giving teddy bear vibes, right? Comment Team Texture if you're here for the fluff. And then pipe in his other arm, reaching down to touch the rocket, and then use your scribe to shape it and pop any air bubbles and make sure the icing gets all the way down to the icing beneath. And then I'm going to grab my black icing and go ahead and pipe in a triangle for his nose and 2 little dots for eyes. I'll use my scribe to shape the nose and the eyes and make sure that I pop any air bubbles, and then we can add the hat brim. I'm piping the hat brim right over the top of his furry little head, and I'll just flood that in with my red icing and then use my scribe to further shape it and make sure that I pop any air bubbles and get the icing all the way down to the cookie beneath. Then I set that aside to dry until the icing crusts over, and I'm just going to add a little blue hat band here, just by making a couple of lines of icing right on top of each other. And then again, I can use my scribe to smooth that icing out if needed. And let's add fur texture just one more time. This cookie's just about done. I'm going to use an edible marker to add a little line for his mouth. And then I actually forgot to pipe in his tail, so I'll use my royal icing to make a little dot for the tail. And then once it sets up a little bit, I used my paintbrush to kind of mush it around to give it the texture. And this cuddly little guy is just ready to blast into your 4th of July with extra sweetness and extra cuteness. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and I hope you have a happy and safe 4th of July.